with yourself or other people, it won't merely be that you're not trying hard enough. You'll encounter something in you or someone who's absolutely malevolent and bent on destruction. And that's also not a hypothesis. You know, the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder reveals quite clearly that people typically develop post-traumatic stress disorder because they encounter some form of malevolence. And if it's ever happened to you, you know that it's no joke. It's not some figment of your imagination. Quite the contrary. So, and then that entire world, that's sort of the world that can be comprehended, is nested inside a broader symbolic network, and that seems to be the symbolic network that's made up of the Dragon of Chaos, which is something like our representation of the set of all currently unknowable things. It's a very strange category, right? It's like the category of zero or the category of infinity. And the reason that we formulated that category is because we don't only want to know how to solve a problem. Just like we don't only want to know how to win a game. We want to know how to win the set of all possible games. And we want to solve the set of all possible problems. And so what the human beings have been trying to do for the last forever is trying to figure out how to solve the problem of the set of all problems. And we actually have some ideas. One is play to win the metagame and not the game. That's one solution. Another solution is go out into the unknown voluntarily and gather the information that lies there, because that continually updates you. The other one is to make sacrifices, and that was discovered in an articulate form not very long ago. And the idea of sacrifice is something like, well, you don't just have to solve the problem of how do you survive in the present, which is roughly the problem that animals are always trying to solve. You have to solve the problem of how you survive in the present, given that you also have to survive next week, next month, next year, and among other people. And the answer to that, in part, is the answer of sacrifice, which is to give up something that you desperately want now, that would even be useful right now, so that you accrue more benefit across a broader span of time. A very, very difficult lesson for animals to learn. Animals have a terrible time learning that. But even human beings have a terrible time doing it, because there's some real intelligence in getting while the getting is good. But it's a suboptimal strategy if you can stabilize the environment and spread out your adaptive capability over wider spans of time. Well, so much the better. You get what you need now, and you get what you need later, and you get what you want, and so does your family and other people. It's a much better solution, but that requires precisely sacrifice, because it requires sacrificing the present for the future. And that idea of sacrifice emerged, like all of our ideas, first in action, in acting these things out, and then conceptualizing them with our bodies, like in drama, just the way that Piaget described children first assimilating the structure of their parents' actions by imitating them, rather than by breaking them down into systems of rules, understanding the rules and incorporating the rules. That isn't how we work. We act and figure things out in action, then we imitate our own actions. And to imitate your own actions is to act yourself out, or to act other people out. You can do that without having explicit articulated knowledge. And it's so crucial to understand that, because it explains a great mystery, which is, how can we tell stories that have meanings that are deeper than we know? And the answer to that is, we have information encoded in our behavior that transcends our understanding. Well, how? Well, we're constantly modifying each other, constantly, and the world's constantly modifying us, and there's no reason that while being modified we should also be able to track how it is that we're being modified. We have to figure that out afterwards, and it's extraordinarily difficult to look at a whole culture or even a single individual and to say, well, what is that person, or what is that societal structure? It supersedes our conscious capacity for representation, so we're always playing catch-up. That doesn't mean that we don't act out things we think sometimes, you know, that the causal pathway can't go the other way, because it can, but more frequently it's bottom up rather than top down, which is how everything works in the biological world. Animals do and have wisdom, but they don't know what they do, and they can't articulate their wisdom. So it's self-evident that a process like this must have occurred. I mean, I was talking about wolf dominance behaviors online the other day, and somebody tweeted and said, it's only captive wolves that dominate each other through aggression. It isn't necessarily the most aggressive males that are dominant in the wild. And I thought, well, yes, I know that. That's what de Waal has already documented among chimpanzees. The thing that emerges as appropriate to lead and then to be imitated as leader isn't untrammeled aggression. It's some process that is akin to my interests and your interests matching over some period of time with all of us considered simultaneously, right? That's some equilibrated state of social behavior, embodied even in the behavior of wolves, the behavior of rats who know how to play fairly, the behavior of chimpanzees, and certainly in our own behavior, much more complexly, in no small part because our social structures are much bigger than those of animals, so therefore much more complex. Robin Dunbar has indicated, for example, that one of the best predictors of brain size, predictors or correlates more likely, one of the highest correlates of brain size, especially, I think he only looked within primates, is group size. And that makes sense, right? Because the complexity of the social organization increases dramatically as the number of individuals involved increases. And I wouldn't say it's group size, brain size that determines group size. It's brain size determines group size, determines brain size, determines group size in a loop. And many other factors are involved in expanding cortical representation as well. So as far as I can tell, there isn't anything contentious in those claims. And it gives us a basis out of which the archetypal stories can emerge, and it explains why we can see revealed truth in them, so to speak, because the truth was instantiated in the behavioral realm, not in the conceptual realm. And through the, you see this in your own life. You watch yourself, and one day you go, aha! That's what I've been up to this whole time. That happens to people in therapy all the time. Or you're dealing with some other person and they tell you something. It's like the last piece fell into place. They say, oh, I had you completely wrong. Now I get what you're up to. And what's happened is my representation has become more complete, but it also matches your behavior better. There's a concordance between what I've observed and what actually manifests itself. And so, well, so for the derivation of wisdom from the observation of behavior. You do the same thing when you analyze a Shakespeare play. A Shakespeare play never happened, but Shakespeare extracted out patterns that happen all the time, and if he hadn't extracted them out, no one would watch the plays, right? The plays are interesting precisely to the degree that the play is about something that's about you and something that's about you and something that's about you. It has to be something that's common to everyone. And you watch the play and you partake in it through imitation, even though you're sitting down, you partake in it through imitation. And then maybe later you go for coffee with your friends and say, well, what was that all about? And that's your attempt to take the behavioral wisdom that's coded in the story and make it articulate. And we're doing that all the time. Whenever you discuss a movie, you do that. And that's how educated people actually interact with literature, right? Because if you're uneducated, roughly speaking, you go see a movie and you just go see it. You never think about it as something that was produced. You never think about it as a cultural entity. And you never do that higher order analysis. And when you first encounter the idea of even doing that, you might be resistant to it because it seems in some sense to destroy some of the magic of that pure immersion in the form. So, but that doesn't mean that people who go to movies and don't talk about them afterwards aren't learning anything. Quite the contrary. They're just learning, using a very abstracted form of imitation. And then you might imagine, you don't go to a movie, you go to 100 movies. And you imitate something that's in common across all the movies. Well, what's that? Well, that's an archetype. The archetype is what's common across stories. And so we're trying to get to the bottom of what's common across stories. And this is the best I've been able to do. It also maps quite nicely onto Heidegger's representation of the world, which is something I only found out later. He has 3 domains of reality that correspond to this very, very precisely. And then Freud's conception is also very similar. Id, ego, superego, right? The id is the natural force within you, positive and negative, because Freud was smart. He knew there was always that dichotomy. And then the ego, that's you, the individual, positive element, negative element. And the superego, which controls you, represses you, inhibits you, and civilizes you, but can also be a complete tyrant. And so part of the reason Freud's theory obtained such purchase so rapidly was because it filled a hole, an archetypal hole that needed to be filled for psychotherapeutic practitioners who in some sense had taken the place of priests and ministers and that sort of, and rabbis and that sort of person. So okay, so that's the representation. And then, well, we've talked about the representation of chaos, and I would think about that, and this is a radical thing to think. It's sort of predicated on the idea that what you confront in your experience is not so much the material world but potential as such. It's the potential that you're constantly contending with that can destroy you and bring you down, but also has as part of its nature that which you can extract and use to build and grow. And we don't think of ourselves as interacting with potential. We think of ourselves as determined by a material substrate, but I don't think the idea that we're determined by a material substrate is as powerful an idea as the idea that we interact with potential. And I also don't think that the idea that we're determined by a material substrate is a more scientific idea than the idea that we're interacting with potential, because I think that, and I do this with hesitancy, because anytime you delve into the quantum realm, the hypothetical quantum realm to ground your arguments, you're doing something very dangerous. But the quantum view of the world seems to be something like being is a field of potential from which forms emerge. It's something like that, and some of the physicists like Wheeler, for example, believe that consciousness plays a key determining role in that, whatever that role might be. So it's not reasonable to think of these ideas as somehow outside of the realm of scientific conjecture, not in the least, especially because they can also be given a deep evolutionary grounding, and that is, why do we represent potential with a symbol like this? Well, it's because that's a great symbol for what lies outside our field of competence. What is that? Predators, dangerous predators, snakes, raptors, carnivores, all amalgamated together in a monster. And it's the monster that, well, it's also the monster that even offers fruit. That's the story in the story of good and evil. Well, or in the story of Adam and Eve. Well, obviously, because you always hunt for nourishment in the face of predation. Obviously, always. And that's a paradox. But it's a paradox that's embedded in everything that you do. The strange thing about these categories is they're not exactly logical categories, they're paradoxical categories. And those sorts of things aren't supposed to exist, because generally the rule for a category is it can't contain itself and its opposite at the same time. But if you've ever dealt with a person on an intimate basis, you know perfectly well that the category indicated by their name contains many paradoxical elements. And they might be paradoxical enough so you can't even live with the person. Right? They're not homogeneous enough so that you can plot a path forward with that entity. Too many things pulling both you and them apart. So some things are A and only A and not B, but some things are A and B at the same time. And complex categories have that nature. I showed you some of the representations of Osiris and Isis emerging from the conjoined serpent. And that's what this diagram represents to some degree. It's, well, what does the chaos of potential first differentiate itself into? You could say, well, it differentiates itself into yin and yang. That's the right way of thinking about it. It differentiates itself into chaos and order. And those are the father and the mother of everything that comes after them. That's one way of thinking about it. And they each have their symbolic realms. And so I've listed some of the common symbols that are associated with these two realms. Now, it's a difficult thing to pin down, because what one of the symbols mean has to be defined in relationship to the other. So for example, if you think about the sky, the earth in relationship to the sky, it's easy to make the earth feminine and the sky masculine. That's a common symbolic representation. But if you contrast the earth with the water, then the water tends to be represented as feminine and the earth as masculine. And so the symbolic representations can shift depending on the literary context, let's say, the broader literary context. And that means you can't just do a one-to-one mapping of the symbolic entity onto the underlying onto the underlying archetypal structure. You have to be attentive to context and nuance.